Bian Que wasn't incorporated into what later became canonized, or what later became the mainstream medicine that we use Ph.D as the symbol of, is that he or the clan or the people around him, they really represented an earlier branch of Chinese medicine. He represented this part of the medicine that was much more closely related to these mantic techniques, whether it was fasting, meditation, talisman, and so on.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological. If you have your health, you have everything. I remember my grandparents saying this to me as I was growing up, and even into the years when I thought I was grown up, but, well, you might remember the hubris of youth as well. I remember thinking that I did not have everything. I didn't have the nice car that they drove. I didn't have a business that supported myself and gave service to a community. I didn't have the sense of purpose that they seemed to have. I didn't realize what they meant was when you have your health, you have the capacity to do anything. I didn't get it that when you have your health, the world is full of opportunity because you have the transformational potential within you to do something meaningful with your life. Having health didn't mean you had a comfortable material life and all of your wishes and hopes were granted. It meant I had the blessing of a good enough mind and a body to work stuff out, enough chi and resiliency to get through hard lessons, and enough optimism to take a chance, and enough fortitude to survive the failures. Health is not a thing. It's a potential, a capacity, a kind of oddly yin-yang polarized invitation and challenge. My grandparents in their day were often excluded, but they did not feel oppressed. They built and flourished as they could. They created something out of nothing. And enough something that I could misinterpret if you have your health, you have everything, to mean if I have my health, I should have everything of which I'm desirous. What I've come to discover is that if I have my health, I have opportunity. But opportunity does not pay the rent, put food on the table, or give a sense of well-being in life. Opportunity is a chance. In Chinese, the characters that represent opportunity are ji hui. Ji means a crucial moment. Hui means meeting, gathering, or a chance. Together, they mean opportunity and remind us of the fleeting and ever-changing nature of these precious moments. And it is our health that allows us to recognize and seize these pivotal moments. What we do with those moments, the trajectory that it puts us on, that can take years to reveal. Very little in life that creates sustainability and value comes instantly. And it is our health that allows us to persevere. Health does not give us everything, but it does allow us the opportunity to discover and create. It allows us to discover our true measure. In a moment, we're going to sit down with Shelley Ochs and discuss one of the lesser-known members of the Chinese medical pantheon, the bird-headed god, Bian Que. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear Don't Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Geological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients. And then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lau, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com, and where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AcuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit acufastneedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
Bian Que harkens back to a time of myth and magic, and if it was not for a cache of scrolls that were found while digging a subway in Sichuan province, we might not be having this conversation today. But Shelley's Ph.D. is on Bian Que, so get ready for a wild ride through history and culture. I find it curious that bird-headed gods show up in so many places, from ancient Egypt to the Pacific Northwest to South America, India, and Indonesia. Let's get into today's conversation with Shelley on the mythic master of medicine, Bian Que. Shelley Ochs, welcome to Geological.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on the show again. We spoke last summer when COVID was blowing up big time all over the world. You and Tom were on the show. There's some amazing work that you guys did with compiling resources for COVID.
Well, we thought we had to do something.
Well, you did, and it was wonderful. And all y'alls that haven't checked out that show, if you have interest in the methods that were used in China at that time, it's over on the website. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're not here to talk about modern uses of Chinese medicine. We're here to go way, way back into like mythic times, really, and talk about Bian Que.
Yes.
So I'm psyched to do that. But before we do, I'm curious to know, I mean, you're from Kentucky originally or something like that, aren't you? Is it Kentucky that you're from?
I am. I'm from Middle America. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky.
From Louisville.
Louisville. Yeah. You're close enough to know that that's the way we say it. I wouldn't dare say Louisville.
No.
When I'm there, people think I'm from out of town.
That's right. But now you're in Beijing. How did you wind your way from Louisville to Beijing?
That's a really good question. Well, I have a narrative that I can make coherent and make sense at this point. But the truth, like many people's lives, is much more accidental and either, serendipity or just pure coincidence. But essentially, I was flying. I'll start there. So Shelley Ochs, I'm 19 years old, flying from New York to Munich to visit a boyfriend. It's love that compels us to do these things often, right?
Yes,
so
that has launched so many of us in so many directions.
Right? Some relationship with someone somewhere in the world. And the reason I was doing that, to go back even further, is I went to school for a year at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. First year, they gave my family a lot of financial aid. Second year, they gave significantly less, which I found out decades later was not an uncommon experience with those kind of private schools there in the late 80s. So I couldn't go back to school the second year. And for that reason, that's why I was sort of free and easy and looking for other adventures and other learning experiences. And being 18, 19 years old, I thought, I'll just do this first, whatever I wanted to do that was right in front of me. And then, I'll figure school out later. So there I was in New York, flying to Munich, and there was a snowstorm. And there were all of these businessmen from Munich that were very irate and wanted to fly right away. And so Pan Am, an airline that doesn't exist anymore, they asked for volunteers, who's willing to wait until tomorrow. And so there were 3 of us actually, all between 18 and 22. We raise our hands and they say, yeah, great. So we go over, and then the person at the counter says, well, you bought student tickets. I bought this $250 one-way ticket to Munich. And she said, oh, well, really, we should only just give you $50 as compensation. But she looked at our young faces, and I wish I could find this person because it changed my life. She looked at our young faces and she said, oh, I'll give it to you anyway. So she gave us a free voucher round trip anywhere in the world that Pan Am flies.
Wow.
So we called my friend and I said, Karen, can we stay with you? We have no place to stay. She said, sure. And I said, we got this free ticket. I'm going to India. And she said, India? Why India? And I said, I just want to go someplace completely different. Mm-hmm. Fair enough, right? Yep. Louisville, Kentucky, yep. Wherever we ended up in India. So we flew to Munich, and then later I ended up we did go to India. We spent 3 months traveling there. And then I ended up in Taiwan after traveling around Asia for a few months, half a year. And I got really interested in Chinese, partially because I was so tired of just traveling and looking at things superficially. So I found myself in Taiwan in 1989. Very easy, good time to be there. As an American native English speaker, you made 500 NT an hour for private lessons, which was very good money. Then 300 for classes, and so I just sank into Chinese. I can still remember when I bought my first cassette recorder and my first books. Mm-hmm. And I really did that just out of curiosity. I didn't have, of course, any plan for sure. And I also didn't really have preconceived notions. Later I would certainly meet people who came over from Brown and University of Michigan and French universities and so on, who came with this sort of views already of what they expected to see in Taiwan. But for better and for worse, I was seeing everything with fresh eyes because I knew nothing about China or Taiwan from growing up. And at that moment in the late 80s, early 90s in Taiwan, it was a time when the whole society was asking itself a lot of questions. What is traditional culture? What is modern culture? Who do we want to be? And intense debates about language. Taiwanese doesn't have a script. And so there was debate about, well, let's give it one. I mean, we invented Baihua. In other words, we created ways to write the vernacular or colloquial speech in the north of China into script. Why can't we do that here in the South with a different dialect, as it were? And then other people said, no, the beauty of it is that it doesn't have a script. So that was my entry into Chinese culture and anything related to China.
I love that. I have found in my life that it's what has come from the periphery that has always held the most meaning and taken me down the most interesting paths, right? There's all those things that you're supposed to do, or you think you're supposed to do. I'm going to climb the corporate ladder, or I'm going to get such and such a degree. There's a way that the world and our family tells us how we're supposed to be. Or sometimes we just get an idea and we go, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. And you start down the path and then your airplane gets canceled. I mean, yes, I just love it.
Right.
The airplane gets canceled and you meet a person who says, I'm going to give you a free ticket anyway. And your life is completely different.
That's right.
Yes. So I'm just wondering, people listening to this at this moment in time, if they're coming up with their own story, if it wasn't for that angel that showed up at a particular crossroad, I would not be the person I am today.
Yes, some particular moment of serendipity. And then your own willingness, which sometimes seems crazy in retrospect, right? But to take the plunge, to jump off the cliff.
Yes. And so this is where the Chinese word yuan fen,
yeah, very much so,
makes so much sense, because it often gets translated as fate.
Mm-hmm.
But my sense of it is that it's fate plus willingness. It's not fate like it's going to grab you by the scruff of your neck and say you're going over here. It's an opportunity that arises in a moment, and something in you says yes.
Right. Something that's meant to be, but you still have to accept it.
You have to accept it. You have to give your own permission.
Right.
There's a bit of agency in that moment.
Another aspect of my own story, thinking about studying Chinese just because I wanted to, and actually even later to a certain degree studying Chinese medicine, although that actually led to a career, and that was the idea from the beginning. So that was more practical than studying what I was doing before, say politics or comparative literature or philosophy or something. But every degree that I've gotten has been something less than a practical, calculated decision. And I've had a chance to reflect upon that living in China. I've been in Beijing for almost 14 years now. And I know a number of people who are the same age, which is fascinating. For example, I know people that in the early 90s, when they were also young, they were in Beijing in rock bands, local people, and just talking about what we thought was possible for our lives. And I have to say, even though I grew up in a working class, very ordinary family, my parents are high school graduates, and my mom went back to school later and got an associate's degree. So I think she also modeled that for me, of continuing to study and really going through some hardships. So thank you, Mom, for that. But I realized that I grew up in the fat years in the States. I was a child in the 70s and 80s. And so even in my extended family, we were living through times where it was easy to make a living. It was easy to have the mini American dream in terms of buying a house, and you could get a mortgage, and having 2 cars, and going on vacation, and maybe even having a parent at home who didn't work. So I know now that very much affected my mentality. Even though I certainly didn't come from wealth, I came from a sense of security, that the collective really affects your times, really affect your individual mentality and what you think is possible.
That's a great point. I came just a little earlier than you did. But yes, there's that sense, an underlying sense of security. It doesn't mean you don't have to work hard. It doesn't mean that you've got everything, but you've got an opportunity to do things like following your curiosity. There's enough of a base of stability that you can take a leap into something that you don't know.
At least a belief. At different points, people have assumed that I had support or something behind me. And Somehow it so far hasn't really been my fate, as it were, to have that. But there was a certain level of confidence, and I know part of that comes from having the good fortune to have been born in a developed country at a time when the country was doing well, and so I didn't have the fears and insecurities that I see in people here. So as you know, you've lived here. Even people who have made money, even if it's not the sort of, rags to riches, they've made a lot of money quickly, just the sort of ordinary, went to school, worked hard, and now they're a professional in some field, people feel very insecure. They feel very afraid often of losing that money and that security. So I think that's just something to reflect upon now as I am a parent and thinking about the circumstances my daughter is growing up in, which is kind of a mix of the two, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to be said for having enough security, but not too much, so that
Yes.
you also have to scratch it out. You have to apply yourself. You can't just sit back and say, okay, I'm given this, and okay, that's great, whatever. You have to put your heart in. You have to push. You have to take some risks. I think that's very helpful.
Yes, I think in some ways that was a blessing, and kind of drawing off of that, I've reflected quite a bit about education, my own, and just being in China because my daughter goes to public schools, and I do think that if the educational system in the U.S. works for you, one of the things that it gives people, and one of the things that I think I benefited from, is true curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
When I wrote my dissertation on Bian Que, I wasn't sure. I went through the whole process of getting a Ph.D. here. I didn't know that would lead to anything practical. I suppose that's not unusual, but I had a driving curiosity and a certain kind of willpower, really, because I wrote my dissertation at one of the more sort of challenging periods of my life. I had a small child who wasn't sleeping through the night. She was 3 when I graduated, and she reached sleep maturity late. And I was working to support myself. And then I was trying to write this dissertation. So the only real solution was to get up early in the morning, which had never been my habit before. But I'd go to bed, at 9:00 with her, and then I would get up at 5. She would wake me up a couple times in the middle of the night, but I would get up at 5, make a cup of coffee, and the house would be quiet for a couple of hours. And I had this huge desk that I bought from IKEA, and I had all these pieces of paper on the wall because I wanted to not forget different strands of the dissertation I was writing, and then also a couple pieces, words of encouragement to myself. And I would get up, and I at least had 2 hours from 5 to 7, that last sort of 8 months to finish the dissertation. And that worked. I would sneak in pieces here and there otherwise. But I think that what I hope for my own child is that she also has that kind of drive, that you just really have questions that you want to answer and you want to create something, because writing is very creative.
Yes.
So I hope that she has that.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code Qiological for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. Well, you've certainly had an opportunity to model it for her, so we'll see what the future brings with that. Yes.
I don't know if she remembers, but I told her.
So Bian Que. Now, there's a really practical aspect of Chinese medicine to investigate. Whatever led you to Bian Que besides your unending curiosity? What opened that up for you?
Well, the truth is that it was a topic suggested to me. So I learned a lot of things about how the Chinese academic world works and the sort of pros and cons of it, I guess you'd say, while I was doing my Ph.D. So if you have a good supervisor, which I had, I was very fortunate. I chose Liu Changhua, and he accepted me. I chose the head of the Research Institute for Medical History and Medical Literature, which is only, I should say, Chinese medical history and literature. It's not history of medicine in general. And he suggested this topic. He said, "Why don't you write about Bian Que and how he somehow is related to bird totems or the totem culture of the areas where we find his images." And he gave me this topic for several reasons. One is he thought it was important, which turned out to be absolutely prescient. We'll get to that. But a couple of years later, well, from the time he gave me the topic to when the archaeological findings were published, it was probably more like 4 years. But he felt that something in the future would be discovered about Bian Que, and he was right. But he chose this topic about totems, which turned out to be a rather sort of outdated way of talking about religion or beliefs or, anything in anthropology. So that was a bit of a challenge, but you could always investigate it from another angle. He felt that, first of all, I would be more objective, for better or for worse. He thought I would be more objective because I don't have the same cultural background as my Chinese colleagues. He thought that I could just deal with the topic of religion in a more objective way. So that was an interesting assumption. And frankly, he felt that writing about a topic like that wouldn't hurt my career, because that's a sort of unusual topic if you're in history of medicine here, and there might come a point in the future where it wouldn't really be to your advantage to have written about something related to primitive beliefs, as they're so called here, or religious beliefs and so on, or shamanism. So that was the other reason. So he gave me this topic, and he said, "Well, you might have to really do some digging." And I said, "Okay," not really knowing what he meant, and that's how it began.
Wow. So you used the word totem.
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Well, when we talk about Bian Que, there's a whole set of phenomena or different kinds of evidence about this figure of Bian Que. So the main record, and the one that most people are familiar with, is in the record of the court historian, or sometimes called the grand scribe's records, where you have these stories of 3 stories of a Bian Que who was a physician. But besides that, you have all of these mentions of him, and it might be one sentence or just several sentences, but he's mentioned in 15 different medical and non-medical books before the Tang Dynasty. And then perhaps it's suggested that Bian Que is actually Qin Yue Ren, who's the author of the Classic of Difficulties, right? The 81 difficulties. And then you have this evidence that there was either a clan, that's a suggestion, a medical lineage, or just one extraordinary master teacher in these areas of Shandong province, where you find these tomb reliefs. You find these carvings within tombs that show a half human, half bird figure with something in his hand that looks like maybe a a Bian Que, maybe one of the early stones that were used for healing, or maybe some type of stone needle. And so one of the main questions then is, how do you put all these things together? How do you get from this half human, half bird figure that's found only in this area of China, but found on maybe 4 different sites, let's say. Some of them are disputed, but found in these different areas. And he's been clearly identified as being related to Bian Que because there's at least one that has words, that has a sort of description next to it. And then now you have this archaeological evidence. They were building a subway outside of Chengdu in Sichuan province, and they stumbled upon something, the people that were digging, and they said, okay, we got to call the archaeological bureau in Chengdu. And the bureau there actually gets 300 calls a year. And so someone went out to look at it, and they had the knowledge and the intuition. I've actually met this group of people, and they had the foresight to say, no, I'm sorry, you need to stop, and you need to really let us dig this one out properly. And it turned out that there are 976 bamboo slips, just these little thin slips of bamboo that have medical writing on them. And there are 5 of them. Most of them are damaged, actually, but there are 5 of them that basically say, Bian Que said, just like we find in the Yellow Emperor's Classic, right? It says Huang Di said, or Chibo said. It says Bian Que said. And so this is really incredible evidence taken together with all the contents, right, of what the scrolls tell us, that there was some kind of medical lineage related to a Bian Que.
That is such a fortunate find.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. And actually, there are so many different pieces of it. Another is that the particular infrared technology that they used had only been recently invented or become widely available, because these sticks, when they come out of the tube, they literally just look like a pile of muddy sticks. I mean, people knew what they were, but you can't read them until you clean them off and you use this infrared to see the writing on them, because the writing is ink. It's not like they're carved or something. The writing
and
is
it's
ink.
Thousands of years old, and it's been buried.
And because the grave had been robbed once, some of the contents sank further. They were wet, but they were just moist enough to be preserved without being destroyed. So we could do a whole show about that, but that's also part of the Bian Que evidence. And then in addition to that, you find temples to Bian Que all over China. And, some of them claim to be quite old. Some of them are probably more recent, but that certainly at least tells you something about the status of Bian Que within folk culture. And I went to one of these temple festivals, which was actually a little bit more complicated than I expected. So the festival is at a Bian Que temple. This is in a place called Nei Jing in Hebei. And we can very reliably say that it's been a temple dedicated to Bian Que since the Song dynasty. And there are some of these sort of stone steels with writing that were preserved during the Cultural Revolution, because the people in the neighboring villages took them. They knew that Red Guards or other people were coming. They took them and they hid them. They buried them. And so then after everything sort of settled down again, they took them out. So we still have these stones. So the temple has a festival every year for Bian Que, and that's frankly why it's allowed to take place. And because, as you know, the government regulates religion rather strictly, we'll say, and so people come and that's what it's supposed to be for. But that's not what the people there will tell you that they're doing. They're worshiping other local deities in the temple rather than Bian Que. Bian Que is just sort of the site and the name, and maybe they'll go and burn some incense to him as well. But there's a much more complex picture going on. But what's interesting is that when these festivals take place, there are still, even up till today, I mean, I went there just actually now it's been maybe 9 years ago, but they tell stories these oral legends related to Bian Que.
So there's an oral history that goes with this that's come down over years and years and years. There's a way that people have been talking to each other.
And when I first mentioned that to some of my colleagues, because it's so hard to prove continuity, they were very skeptical. But I persisted and I thought about it. I thought, in Shandong province, for example, you have stories about fox fairies, other kinds of legends that are based on beliefs that persist. And some of those legends or versions of them are also probably 1,000 or 2,000 years old. That's not out of the realm of possibility. So you can't prove the continuity, but what's interesting is that some of the oral tales clearly reflect the more mythological elements in the record of the court historian. So, for example, in the extant text that we have today, which was written in the 1st century BCE, right? It was compiled roughly 1st century BCE. It tells the story in the very beginning that Bian Que was a sort of manager at an inn, and there was this mysterious patron. And he came in one day and he says, I've been watching you and I think you're worthy. And I have these Jin Shu. Jin Shu means secret books, or we said Jin Fang, or secret formulas, but it also means powerful. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. And he said, I'm going to show them to you. And he gave him a drink. And he said, I want you to drink this. And after 30 days, you'll be able to see through people. And then the story goes that that's what he did. And that's what happened. And then that's how this Bian Que in the first story becomes a healer. Well, in the oral legend, it's a little bit different. Bian Que, which is still what he's called, he meets a Taoist. I mean, they call him that. He meets this sort of roving Xian, this sort of immortal Taoist teacher, and he follows him into the mountains, and he loses him, and then suddenly he appears behind him, like in a movie or something, and he says, "I'm going to give you these books, these scrolls, but you can't open them until after you go into a cave and you meditate for 30 days and you also drink this drink." So he goes in and he does, I guess, what a lot of us would do. He opens them right away and he doesn't wait. And he says, "Oh, they're blank."
Of course they are. Of course they're blank because he hasn't done the work yet. You can't open the book until you have a certain kind of consciousness. And then you can see what's in the book.
You can see. And in the story, that is what he does, because I suppose they want to make it a complete, moral allegory. It could be just a warning tale, but it's more than that. It's a little bit more positive. He does.
Well, these things are often a warning allegory, right? It often is a warning allegory. It's like, don't do this, right? You're going to get in trouble. But it's like
right.
It's like Jewish people say, you're not supposed to say the name of God. Right. And as a kid growing up, it's like, ooh, I'm getting hit by a lightning bolt. But no, it's not. It's not that. It's just that if you try to name what's unnameable, you cut yourself off from everything that's available by that which is not named.
I've always loved that. Just Hashem. There was a couple of years in my life where I lived with a whole group of students in a Jewish co-op, actually. And I always, because I come from the Bible Belt, as we've just been talking about. So I thought that's just a great way to say it. If you're going to believe in this, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Isaiah, the monotheistic God, to just say the name, something that can't be named.
So it
made much more sense than
you need a certain level of cultivation. We talk about this all the time in our profession, that we have to cultivate ourselves and, calligraphy and qigong, whatever. But those are the usual ways we talk about it. But there is, I suspect, a refinement of spirit and a refinement of consciousness. I'm not talking about good, bad. I'm just saying to be able to open a book and actually see what's in it, because you can open I think you've had this experience. We've all had the experience. We've read a certain book at a certain time and it said something to us. And we open that book and we read it again 10 years later. It's a whole different book.
Right. And some of my teachers used to say that about our Chinese medical classics. I mean, when I was going to school in California, she'd say, "Okay, I'm teaching you the Shanghai Lun and Jingui now. You can reference it, you can put it away, but really take it out again in 3 years and read it through, and you will understand it on a whole nother level."
And even something as simple as the Materia Medica or your basic book on acupuncture points, you can bring those out again after 10 years of experience, and it will tell you something else.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So Bian Que, I've always loved that story about being able to see through a person so that you could see what's going on for a person. And the story that I got was the whole idea behind pulse diagnosis. It wasn't that, oh, he discovered pulse diagnosis, but that he could actually see what was going on with someone. But you can't tell somebody that I've got this like super X-ray vision, because that's going to flip people out. So you do the pulse instead, right? It's like, I got this thing, it's in my hands. Oh, yeah, the kidney. I mean, he's like looking at the kidney.
There is a passage that suggests that, yes, that he is saying that it's from the pulse. In general, though, Bian Que is part of a tradition, really, of people that had something we call fangji, or techniques. So the Li Ling, this scholar at Beijing University here, who's done a lot of what was originally very controversial work, actually, on sort of warring states or spring and autumn period, what we might call shamans, diviners, adepts, and so on. Bian Que was very much, at least that Bian Que, was very much a part of that tradition. People in possession of techniques. So I think part of why Bian Que wasn't incorporated into what later became canonized, or what later became the mainstream medicine that we use Ph.D. as the symbol of, is that he or the clan or the people around him, they really represented an earlier branch of Chinese medicine as it later became sort of canonized. He represented this part of the medicine that was much more closely related to these mantic techniques, whether it was fasting, meditation, talisman, and so on, even though we don't have very specific descriptions of that. You know, the descriptions of Bian Que are about him using stones, using hot compresses, using herbs, and things like that. But he very much comes from that tradition.
And we often hear about how Chinese medicine started with these more shamanistic practices. And lots of medicines had that. I mean, back in, like Eastern Europe, the whole thing with protecting against the evil eye and curing against that, and talismans and amulets and spells and all those kinds of things. It kind of rhymes with this. And the thing that we have about Bian Que too, this image of him, this really curious image of a human being with a bird head, right?
Right.
Which makes me think about like Northwest Native Americans. In some of the ceremonies they have, there's people with these big bird heads, doing dances and ceremonies. And you've got ancient Egypt with Horus, the bird-headed god. This kind of thing shows up in different places and at different times.
Right. And comparisons have definitely been made, also even with Mayan culture, but with different regional cultures in China. Definitely, they call it nuo. There were certain kinds of ceremonies, shamanistic rituals in Dongbei in northern China, where people might have been wearing headdresses that made them look like birds. So there's a suggestion that this is just sort of a stylistic representation of that. But the question really is this: you're finding these images, and he's really a full, except for the human head and the human with a hat and a human arm, he's really a bird. So that's where the totem idea comes from. But my research looking at not just the isolated images of Bian Que on these tombs, but looking at the whole composition and where we see him, you notice a few things. And one of the things that one can notice is that he's generally very high on these registered. So there'll be panels, and the lower panel will be human life. It'll be something about the deceased. If the deceased was an official, they'll show him on sort of a throne or a high place, and they'll have maybe these kitchen scenes, and then they'll have sort of going up the levels, literally. You'll have different types of culture bearers, you'll have legendary figures, and then at the very top is supposed to be some sort of celestial realm. It may or may not have been the afterlife. Sometimes there were two levels. There was the afterlife that the deceased would sort of ascend into, and above whatever afterlife one might be in, there was an even sort of higher celestial realm. And often that had Shi Wang Mu, the Queen Mother of the West. Bian Que is always in those higher levels. And even though, of course, there can be layers of meaning, and there, as I said, there is one relief that it actually, to be honest, doesn't say Bian Que. It says San Que. It actually just refers to the bird part, the mountain magpie. So because of the relationship with medicine and stones, and he even appears to be taking a pulse, there's a relationship between this image and the art of medicine. However, you don't know what came first. So with other people like Sun Simiao or Zhang Zhongjing, there were clearly historical figures that were deified, and then you have temples to those deities, and the progression is very clear. So with Bian Que, the question is, well, maybe it's just that this person lived so long ago, we don't have records, and then later he became deified and then was put on these Han Dynasty stones. But I think that's actually not the most plausible explanation. First of all, I've asked people who research tomb art, right? Han Dynasty tomb art. I say, well, you have legends, you have gods, you have other symbols, and they do vary a little bit regionally. You have these on these Han tombs. How long do you think something needs to circulate before people feel like it's important enough and recognizable enough? So artists, there were actually these workshops where people would produce these things. Obviously, they were using symbols that the family of the deceased commissioned and that would be recognizable to other people that would see them. So how long does something have to be around before it's worthy of being carved into one of these tomb reliefs? And the answer is always, well, gosh, we don't know, but certainly at least several hundred years, that you're not going to find something normally innovative or new on these reliefs. So I think it's also possible that the deity came first, because you find these in this region, and the explanation that, well, they had the bird or different kinds of birds as their totems. And so when this clan of healers became known as very effective and perhaps invented new technology, if you will, through stones and Bian stones, which come from a place called Sixian. They come from this place in Shandong province. It's probably more likely that it was the other way around, that you had a deity that was associated with life and death. You had this image, as you're suggesting, that is related to birds, and birds in China were also very much related to sun worship and the cult of the sun, which you find, of course, also all over the world because it relates to life. You probably had the deity first. And then later, through a process which we can't necessarily describe through texts and has been lost through oral tradition, then later you have this method of healing that somehow is associated with this deity. And that's kind of the the mystery of it as it stands. There's still a lot of unanswerable questions.
Of course, it's lost in the mists of time. In having this conversation with you, where my mind is going at this moment, I'm so glad we started off talking about curiosity, because that's such good fuel for any endeavor. It's reliable. It's reliable fuel for any endeavor. First of all, the idea that this could be a clan of people makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, individual people do make impacts on the world, but a group of people has more sustainability. And I'm even thinking of, in more modern times, like the Menghe clan, right? Or, you've got your group of doctors in Zhejiang province. There's these different communities of people who get an idea about something, or they discover something, or they become known for something because they figured it out. People talk about them. Their methods get passed on because their methods are effective, and so people want to learn that. So the idea that there's a clan, there's a group, there's a more than one person who has developed something, and it's been useful, and so it gets written down, and so people talk about it. That makes a lot of sense to me. The other thing that I find very curious about this is that you said this could be an alternative lineage, that there is a stream of medicine, there's a current of medicine that came out of things that Bian Que had to say about medicine, that perhaps was different than what Ph.D. had to say about medicine. But for some, for whatever reasons of history, or, accidents of power, or who knows what, Ph.D. is what gets passed along. But Bian Que, we heard about that cat, but we don't know much about him. He was the other team. That was Team B.
Right. So that's a very sticky question, as you can imagine. And people tend to have very passionate opinions about it. So one of the longest works about this whole question is by a scholar named Li Bozong. And he says, before the Song dynasty, the question of the importance of Bian Que was not a question. So the problem from where we stand today is that it's very hard to recreate, and it's very hard to know the importance or lack of importance, not just of particular books, but of the ideas contained in the books. So the extant, Huangdi Nei Jing that we have is really from the Song dynasty. Now, if you analyze the grammar and the words and so on, it's from the Western Han. That's not a problem. That the compilation of the Huangdi Nei Jing primarily took place in the 1st century BC and the 1st century after, so sort of straddling the turn of the millennium there. That's not a problem. But the original bibliographic reference to it talks about 81 chapters, and now we have something like 167. And if you go back and you try to say, okay, a scroll, how many characters was a scroll, however you figure it out, it was much, much less than what we have today. So we don't know what was added. And even more than that, the scrolls that are now compiled into books, were later compiled into books, the scrolls probably circulated independently. That's a pretty well accepted conclusion. So that's why you find, for example, in the Huangdi Nei Jing, there'll be a chapter where it says all of the channels go to the heart, right? The direction of all the yin and yang channels is towards the heart. And then you have chapters like the mythic, where you see the understanding that you and I use today about the different directions of yin and yang. And the reason you find those kinds of contradictions, or you find, pieces of theory, all this stuff about yin and wei, right? The yin qi and the wei qi, that's a really rich theory in and of itself. And it's really not developed in the sort of medicine as it's now taught in textbooks. You find all these contradictions because they circulated separately, and there was no reason why anyone had to make them not contradict each other, right? So when you think about Bian Que and the potential written record, there are scholars who have looked anew based on the new excavated texts, and also really sometimes you find things if you're looking for them, or you don't see them if you're not looking for them, right? And so looking at this, you can look back at the Huangdi Nei Jing and say that about 17 chapters, this is what Huang Longxiang, who's a professor here at the academy, are very related to Bian Que. So a lot of the dialogues with Lei Gong, the thunder god, can be traced to what we think of as the Bian Que lineage.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner, because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi, and that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, if we go and look in the Huangdi Nei Jing, there are traces of the Bian Que tradition that have been compiled into it. Because the Huangdi Nei Jing itself, as you say, and I think we all know, it's a compilation of, at times, very contradictory points of view.
Yeah. And the way you figure that out is you can look backwards and forwards. So you have the Yellow Emperor's Classic from the Western Han. And so then you look forward to, for example, the Pulse Classic 2 or 3 centuries later. And there are a whole bunch of chapters that I included in my dissertation that say they are describing the pulse methods and the meanings of the different pulse diagnostic parameters from Bian Que. So you look at those, and then you look back at the Nei Jing, and you can see the places where, okay, this sentence is almost exactly the same. So perhaps the author of the Pulse Classic centuries later, had a different text that was a common ancestor to these two. And then, so that's sort of looking forward and backward. And then you can look at the new texts that we've excavated from Ma Wangdui and Zhang Jiashan, but also, of course, the new one in Sichuan. And that's extraordinary when you find pieces from those texts that match the Huangdi Nei Jing that we have today. Then you can really start to put together the pieces of the puzzle. So Ma Wangdui is from, the tomb was closed in 168 BC. And the new findings in Sichuan, which are usually called Tianhui or Laoguanshan, they're from about 140. So very close in time, but from different regions. So slowly, as the research on that comes out, we'll start to get a different picture of the different branches, the different strands that went into certainly, first of all, what we think of as the Nei Jing today, but also to put together all these other texts, including some non-medical texts, and see, can we get a clearer picture of what the early medicine looked like, and maybe one that's not so prejudiced, if you will, or one that doesn't so rigidly look through the prism of what we've come to think of as the Nei Jing or the interpretations of it by later commentators.
Really fascinating. Such interesting work you're doing there. All because of an airplane ticket.
Right? You can look at it that way.
So I'm curious, and this is speculation, Is it speculation? Maybe it's speculation. I mean, you're very methodic. I mean, listening to you and having this conversation, I appreciate the scholarship that you brought to this. I appreciate the mind that you brought to this, the history, your understanding of medicine, along with your curiosity about the history. And again, scholarship. I mean, really scholarship. So I'm going to ask you a question here, which, is maybe more about conjecture. So I'm talking to you like more the doctor and the person who has lots of curious ideas.
Okay, I hear you.
If we could sit down with Bian Que today,
Mm-hmm.
what would Bian Que have to tell us about practicing medicine?
Okay, so first of all, if we assume that there was a historical person,
or even a group of people that have this jishu, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we could sit down and have tea with them, we're going to sit down with the Bian Que clan, talk some medicine. What would they have to say?
Well, what they, from textual evidence, really kind of moving away from the more sort of shamanistic or even metaphysical aspects of the divine, if you will, the sort of religious tradition of Bian Que. But if we want to talk about the textual tradition, they emphasized the palpation of the mai. And even though the pulse classic emphasizes sort of palpation at the wrist pulse, right? The earlier tradition that's associated with Bian Que really talks about se mai, meaning color and pulse. So I think if we had that sort of ability to travel back in time, or sorry, I can't help but think of it this way. If we discovered more texts, if we had more books, then we would have probably more details about how they used the hue, the color of the face, the color of the eyes, the color of the tongue, and the different sites on the body, certainly so much more than just the wrist. The pulses on the neck and the ankle and the groin and so on. And perhaps some very, very subtle palpation, perhaps closer to what my mentor, Wang Jui, has done. It's hard to say, because when people talk about palpating the mai in some of those early texts, they do suggest that you take your fingers and roll, that you press, that you sort of push up and down. So I don't know. There's some suggestion there that what they were doing might have looked like the channel palpation.
Sure. I mean, after all, mai could mean the pulse. Mai could mean the channel.
Oh, well, we know it means the channel. I mean, there are very, very few places where it's ambiguous. Well, it's ambiguous in the sense that it could be a site on the body that's identified as both. Like there's a pulsating vessel there, and it's also a vessel that's used for either bloodletting or needling with stones. So yeah.
So these were really hands-on practitioners.
I've never thought of it that way, but yes.
We could consider these. I'm just imagining into it here.
I mean, they were very observation and using the senses.
Watching and looking and palpating.
Right.
And this gets into dicey ground here when we start talking about, well, what about the metaphysical aspects? Because, of course, that gets squirrely quickly. Mm-hmm. But again, Bian Que is considered this kind of mystical figure. I'm curious to know your thoughts about that side of it. It's not really textual.
Well, people have looked at books like the Nei Jing. I mean, there are certainly descriptions of deities that may be related to him that are part human and part bird. So there's certainly lots that one could talk about in terms of there's sort of the Chinese myth of Hou-Yi, right? Shooting down the 10 suns, that there are 10 suns and they're oppressing humanity because of the heat. And Hou-Yi comes and shoots down 9 and leaves us with just 1. And the images that you have of Bian Que on the tombs include this mulberry tree, which is is a symbol of the sunbird that represents the sun that remains that we need for life. And then at the same time, this mulberry tree is also like a ladder. It's a bridge. So the placement of Bian Que in these images really is very much showing the half human, half bird Bian Que as potentially a deity that comes more from the culture of immortals, or that very early culture in Qi and Lu in what's now Shandong province, where there are mediators between the human realm and other realms. And so it seems that in those images, that's really what Bian Que is, because he's always pictured at that level. He's either way up there with Shi Wang Mu, or he's sort of on top of the mulberry tree, or one level above. So why? Why do you have this bridge between life and death, this guide potentially, really, this sort of, because the tomb art is designed, I wouldn't say for comfort, but it's designed to be a guide, is designed to be a map on a certain level. And so you have this figure there that can help the deceased. I mean, they have chariots sort of people taking the deceased to the Yellow Springs or to other aspects of the afterlife. And so then Bian Que is there as a guide. And at the same time, he's performing a medical act. If you don't want to use the word medicine, then certainly an act of healing.
Well, medicine is often, I mean, it could be, like you said, medical act, but medicine can be something as simple as bandaging a wound, or it could be something as profound as helping to heal a spirit.
Right. Well, helping someone die, for example, I think we would call that a form of healing, helping someone to die at peace. I mean, just to think about it in terms of sort of modern practices that people still do. And then in this case, actually helping someone get to the afterworld, that would have been part of it. But I mean, there's no reason to think that needling points had a role in that process. I guess that would be a startling and important question if one could ever find that there's, why is there this relationship between life and death? So coming back to medical literature, scholars are more inclined to just say that Bian Que, as an extraordinary physician, and in sort of Qin and Han times, that was one of the main roles of a physician, is to let us know whether someone was going to live or die. So they say, 决生死, that was, if you read the classical text, you can still see that, right? We sometimes kind of ignore that. But that was a big function. And then the stories that you find about Bian Que in the Siji also involve life and death. So I don't have an easy answer for that.
Yeah. Well, I was not looking for an easy answer. I don't think there's an easy answer. I'm quite struck that his image shows up in tomb carvings. That lets you know that, like, the Bian Que brand, so to speak, had something behind it. Like you were saying earlier, something doesn't show up on a tomb.
Yeah, that's very true. That it was definitely a widely held and a deeply held belief, as it were, or deeply understood legend, or he wouldn't be there. That's right.
Yes. And I'm also thinking now, all of a sudden, about something we say in Chinese medicine all the time, Tian Di Zhen, right? You've got heaven, you've got earth. What pulls together, what ties together, like the mandate or the image or the potential of heaven with the three-dimensional reality of earth, is human beings. And Bian Que really seems to fall into this, I'm going to say, I'm just thinking this out loud right now, but he kind of falls into that human aspect, that bridging aspect of heaven and earth. He's got feet like a human and some hands, and he's got the head of a bird. So he, in a very beautiful symbolic way, is also connecting heaven and earth.
Right. And more specifically, in cultural or historical context, you do have this culture of what we might call early Taoism, but maybe more accurately, Huanglao thought and the immortal sort of techniques or practices related to that area. So he seems to be associated with those lineages in some ways, perhaps. Early on in my research, I went to see someone at the China Museum here, near Tiananmen Square. And I'm not sure what my classmates said to get me an audience with this person, but he clearly didn't tell the person that, this foreign woman is going to show up on your office door and talk to you about Bian Que, because he looked very surprised when he saw me. But this person, who I won't name, but he's really top in his field, he met me at the gate and kind of let me in the back door of the museum, and we sat down and talked about Bian Que. And he said that he really thinks, honestly, that this was probably a regional deity. He thinks that the myths and the legends are very regional in nature. Now, you could argue against that, because you're finding these images in what used to be Qianlu in Shandong and Jiangsu, and then now we have these findings in Sichuan. But we know that the occupants of the grave, the corpses they found in the tomb in Sichuan, are from Chu in the south. And so if you can kind of picture that, you have something in terms of a textual tradition anyway, traveling from Qianlu in Shandong down to Chu in the south, and then all the way out west to Sichuan. So, sort of how do you put these two things together? It doesn't mean necessarily that the images are not strictly regional, but they seem to have had a wider currency because of the relationship of the name to all of these different texts, because you find the, Bian Que said all the way out there in Sichuan.
Well, and it seems to me this, in many ways, is the natural history of development of human societies and human thought, which is that a good idea shows up somewhere and it gets some traction, and other people start to cotton to it. Or maybe people who are part of a tradition, they move somewhere and they share that idea, and other people cotton to that. And so it spreads. Good ideas tend to spread.
Right. There's reason to think that even though we have pretty good evidence now that different techniques and the theories behind those techniques very much developed regionally, there was a process, a non-linear, rather messy process of them being blended into what we at least recognize as a single tradition today. So we know that massage and different, perhaps gua sha, those sort of work that we do on the sinews came from the South, and some of the earliest decoction traditions, that part of the herbal medicine, came from the West. And then the 9 needles came from a certain place. And we think that this type of needling early on with Bian Shi came from this area that's associated with these images of Bian Que. Because I would like to say there's indirect evidence of activity in this area. And this is this area of Shandong. And of course, this is something controversial. Sometimes people kind of are cynical. They'll say, I just read a translation of something and they said, some scholars have a cottage industry trying to prove the importance of Shandong in terms of the Bian Que legend. But the evidence is that Chun Yu Yi, the physician in the same chapter of the Record of the Historian, which was essentially the disciple of Bian Que on some level, or one of the BianQues, he was from Shandong, from Lini, and we know that's well established. And then the author of the Pulse Classic, Wang Shuhe, he was from Shandong. He was from a place called Donggao. And then Zhou Yan, who you probably know is the first person to really systematically write about the 5 phases, he was from the Jinan area of Shandong. And then the Bian Shi, the stones themselves, are from Si County in Shandong, and then you only find these images there. So something was going on culturally and perhaps politically and economically as well to support a set of ideas that later really became one of the cornerstones of Chinese medicine.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about in our modern world, if you want to go like to see a really, really good Western physician, well, you got to go to New York or LA or the Mayo Clinic or, I mean, this is not a new thing. There are people who are extremely skilled at what they do. They often will gather together partly because they help each other get better at what they're doing. I mean, if you want to get better at something, you surround yourself with people that are better at it than you are, or at least at your level, but ideally a little bit better, because then you get better. You all get better when you push each other. And so I can see how these kind of concentrations of knowledge and skill and ability could happen, because these kind of people gather together and then the word spreads. So you might be down in the South, but you know about those cats up there in Shandong because they're famous, and they're usually famous for a good reason.
Well, these networks may have happened through all kinds of processes that we don't know about, but certainly through the elite. If you look at the records of who Chun Yu treated, people have actually even just in the last few years really outlined that very specifically, and they were supported sometimes through being given official positions, in the bureaucracy, and maybe sometimes just being supported as a physician to a particular, marquee or account or so on. So definitely through the elite networks, people would hear of extraordinarily talented physicians and then request/order them to come and treat them and their families.
Not much different than today.
Interesting. Yeah, different dynamics, different social system, but there's a parallel there. Sure.
Different dynamic, but similar kind of thing. People who have resources tend to use those resources, and they seek out the best resources they can acquire.
Yes.
It's kind of how humans are. Wow. Well, I feel like we could go for hours chewing over Bian Que, but it's time to wind it down for now, and I know it's getting late there in Beijing.
Yes. I don't know if I've given a clear picture about the whole sort of controversy about Bian Que and all the different aspects of it. I haven't translated my dissertation into English. In fact, I finished it 8 years ago. I was thinking about that before we had this conversation. It would have been right around this time, it's the middle of April, 8 years ago, that I would have gotten the good news that I passed anonymous review, because you have to send out your dissertation without anything, your name, your institutional affiliation, or your supervisor's name. And you just they send it out to 3 people in your field, and they evaluate your work. So that's the hard part, actually. Because your committee will generally have already given you feedback and you make corrections. That's the way it works. So it's been some time, but the archaeological findings, which have not been published, by the way, but when they do come out, I do plan to return and at least select one piece of this that I want to revisit. And by the way, for people that are interested, the photographs and it's called the shiwen. So basically the transliteration of the bamboo slips that were found in Sichuan, a book of those photographs should come out this year.
So those who can read that stuff can read it.
Right. And, reading the original script is sort of one set of skills. It's something between a clerk script and an earlier script, but there'll be the modern Chinese and some annotations, and then perhaps someone will eventually translate it, but certainly pieces of it will be translated as people begin to write about it. And there'll be a special edition of Asian medicine that I'm contributing to, and Donald Harper, Vivian Lowe are the main editors, and Dolly Yang is working on that. and that will come out then probably early next year with a set of articles about those findings.
So we can look forward to some scholarly perspectives and some good scholarship, good hard work that will give us hopefully some access into these other aspects of our tradition. It's already such a rich tradition, and thank you for this conversation, for one. It's got me thinking about all kinds of things, and for the work, I hope I get a chance to read it someday.
Thank you. I think there's always a question that arises about why should practitioners care about history? And that's a valid question, I think. I think sometimes people are just curious about the origins of our medicine. Many people have expressed that to me. Sometimes people are hoping for something actually clinically useful, and that can happen or often doesn't. But I do think that sometimes we get indirect inspiration when we learn about the actual original texts, some of the original healers, some of the original social networks that people were working within. And I think those things can inspire us in a sort of indirect way, or at least I hope so.
I have found for myself, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about airplane tickets, all the best stuff in my life has come from the periphery. All the best stuff has come not because it was condensed and solid and straightforward, and here's ABC of how to do it, but it somehow sparked a curiosity. It somehow sparked an inquiry that led me to asking questions I would have not otherwise asked. And that, I think, can be incredibly useful. Good questions tend to be enlivening, and they tend to open us up to perspectives that we then have an opportunity to discover for ourselves how things might work and how they might be helpful in the work that we do.
Right. And I really invite everyone that's interested in history to really take a look at what's come out in the last 10 years or 20 years, really. I graduated from school in the year 2000, and a lot of things have come out in English since then. For example, there's a book called An Illustrated History of Chinese Medicine with Linda Barnes and T.J. Henricks as the editors. We can actually, of course, put these on the website. But I think that more accessible works have come out in the last 20 years that allow the general reader or your sort of average practitioner of Chinese medicine to be able to learn something authentic and historically accurate, and that has a certain sophistication.
Sounds great. We'll be sure to put those up on the show notes page. So, Shelley, thank you again so much for this time. It's been an absolute delight to take this journey through the mists of time.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on the show.
What Shelley said about Bian Que being representative of another stream of medicine, one that is parallel to that of the Nei Jing, it reminds me that there are so many different approaches to health, life, medicine, and living. The plurality of Chinese medicine is one of its strengths. It is also one of its deepest challenges. So often it comes down to having an inquiring mind that allows us to stand firm in what we know and at the same time remain open to new learning. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.